Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Shandora in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri, Nancy, North Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Belle in Texas, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Doubled off once again. It's such a extended series of short pages. So again, it should be a shorter than normal class, and yet we will do 2 pages and get ourselves a little bit further ahead, which will stand us well in the coming weeks. Our dafs today are pages 38 and 39 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We are working our way through chapter 3 tonight, opening Mishna number 2 of chapter 3. We pick this up about halfway down the very short 38a. Mishnah number 2. There are 3 independent lands in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, with regard to establishing presumptive ownership. So our concept ongoing is that if somebody is occupying, residing on, farming, making use of, benefiting from a piece of land for 3 years, and then someone comes along and says, hey, that's my land, I never sold it to you. Okay, but you didn't protest during the previous 3 years that this possessor was occupying the land. Since you didn't protest during those 3 years, this guy now has the presumptive ownership of that land. We call that a hazaka. You establish a hazaka, in other words, the presumptive condition that we're talking about. In this case, it's a hazaka of ownership of the land. And you establish that over the 3 years of continuous use, and now the burden of proof is on the claimant, right? Whereas if he comes back sooner than 3 years and lodges his protest, well, then the one on the land is going to have to prove that he's legally there. But now that he's been there for 3 years, when the protest comes, when the claim against him comes, now the claimant is going to have the burden of proof. Now, what's interesting here is that we're saying that within the land of Israel, and in Talmudic times, the land of Israel was composed of Judea, in Hebrew, Yehuda, the Galilee, which is northern Israel, and includes the Kinneret, normally is often known as the Sea of Galilee, and the Aver HaJordan, the Aver HaYarden, the Aver HaYarden, That's Transjordan, right? Now known as Jordan, but the eastern bank of the Jordan River. That was considered part of the Holy Land. And what they're saying is that even though you're technically within the land of Israel, within the Holy Land, it's as if you were in another country with respect to, are you and the possessor in the same land? Did you lodge, as we'll see, did you lodge your protest in the presence of witnesses and in such a way that the one in possession of the land was likely to hear about that protest? And that's why we're saying that it's like three regions of the land of Israel with respect to this legal requirement to lodge a protest within the 3 years. Lodging it outside, if the land is in Yehuda and the person, the owner, the original owner is in Galilee, that's going to create a different result than if the land is in Yehuda, in Judea, and the previous owner is also in Judea, right? So that's why they're saying there are three lands with respect to these laws. Okay, so there are three lands with respect to the hazaka of ownership. With regard to establishing the hazaka of ownership: Judea, Transjordan, and the Galilee. If the prior owner of the field, the prior owner, right, the one who's now going to claim it's his and that he never sold it, if the prior owner of the field was in Judea, and another person took possession of his field in the Galilee, or if the prior owner was in the Galilee, and another person took possession of his field that the prior owner owned in Judea. So then the possessor does not establish presumptive ownership until the one possessing the field will be with the prior owner in one province. So according to what we've read so far, it would seem like if the guy went away and he was overseas in another land, or even within Israel, but in one of these other regions, then the fact that you're occupying his land for over 3 years doesn't mean anything, because presumably he couldn't have heard that you're there in order to lodge a protest because he's in some far off land, according to what we've read so far. Until they're in the same province. Rabbi Yehuda says, the sages said that establishing presumptive ownership requires 3 years only in order that if the owner will be in Spain, which is to say the farthest away place that people commonly went to during the period that we're talking about, right? So Spain might as well be the other side of the world. And another possesses his field for a year. So people will go and inform the owner by the end of the next year, right? By the end of 2 years, he'll have heard that somebody's occupying his land while he's away. And then he'll have another year to get back and lodge his protest. That's why we have 3 years to establish the protest, to establish the ownership. So therefore, what difference does it make where the possessor, the former owner is, when this possessor, this occupier, is sitting on his field or takes control of his field? If we follow Rabbi Yehuda, it would seem that the 3-year period already takes into account the idea that he could be in some far off place and not hear that somebody is on his land. But in the absence of Rabbi Yehuda's interpretation, it sounds like, if the guy's out of town, then you going onto his land, is never going to establish that presumption of ownership for you until it can be shown that you're on that piece of land and the prior owner is in the same province, the same region as his field, and both those things are happening for 3 years, and the guy didn't lodge a protest, then the presumption of ownership kicks in. That's what it sounds like so far. That's Mishnah number 2. Now the Gemara is going to help us unpack what we've just read. The Gemara starts by asking, what does the first Tana hold? right? So the first Tana that if they're in different regions, there's no presumption of ownership. What does the first Tana, the first rabbi of this Mishnah, hold in ruling that the prior owner and the field need to be in the same province in order for the possessor to establish this hazaka, this presumptive ownership? If he holds that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the one possessing the field is a valid protest, even in the case where one is in Judea and the other is in Galilee, the protest should be valid as well, right? So we said that you've got 3 years to lodge this protest. Now, does the protest have to be lodged in the presence of the one possessing the land? Or is it enough to lodge the protest in front of witnesses, but not personally in front of the one possessing the land? So, and does our Mishnah, the seeming contradiction of our Mishnah, turn on this question, or does it not turn on this question? Let's keep reading, right? So if the Tana of our Mishnah holds that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is nevertheless a valid protest, then what difference does it make whether the possessor who's on the field and the prior owner are in different regions? As long as the one in the other region, the former owner, hears that somebody's on his land and says in front of witnesses, hey, that guy shouldn't be on my land, and I'm saying that in front of witnesses, then what difference does it make what regions are involved? On the other hand, if the Tana of our Mishnah holds that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is in fact not a valid protest, well then, even in the case where the field and its current possessor are in Judea, and the prior owner is also in Judea, but when he lodges his protest, it doesn't happen in front of the possessor of the current possessor of the land, then that protest shouldn't be a valid protest anyway. And what difference does it make whether they're in the same region or not in the same region? So Rabbi Abba Bar Memel says that Rav says, a second, it's very hot in here today. Okay. So Rabbi Abba Bar Memel says that Rav says, actually the Tana holds that a protest lodged not in his presence is a valid protest. And in fact, that is the law, right? So the former possessor of the land, when he says, hey, that guy who's on my land now, I didn't sell it to him. He's a robber. He shouldn't be on this land. That protest does not have to be lodged in the presence of this person who's now on the land, but it does have to be lodged in the presence of witnesses. And we'll talk more about that soon. Right, so Rabbi Abba Bar Memel says that Rav says, important that Rav says this. Actually, the Tana of our Mishnah holds that a protest lodged not in the presence of the possessor is a valid protest. And the sages taught our Mishnah with regard to a period of crisis. Now we see that the dividing up of Israel into regions for the purpose of this law doesn't have to do so much with how the protest is lodged, whether in the presence of the possessor, whether in the presence of witnesses, etc. But the reason that we're going to make a distinction between the regions is because it's a time of crisis. And that means that there's interference with travel and there's interference with news, right? So the guy in the other region might not hear that somebody is on his land, even though in the normal course of things he would. So in the normal course of things, that's why there's a 3-year period necessary to establish the hazaka of ownership. But during a time of crisis, when there's war, when there's pestilence, when there's difficulty, when people can't move easily, and when news doesn't travel easily, then 3 years is not enough to assume that he heard, and if he wants to protest, he'll have enough time to protest. And that's what our Mishnah is talking about, at least according to Rabbi Abba Bar Memel in the name of Rav, that we're talking about a time of crisis, when travel is perilous and information cannot be transmitted between Judea and the Galilee. Therefore, although no word of a protest was received, the possessor does not establish the hazaka of ownership on the field. And the Gemara asks, but if it is due only to the ownership but if it is due only to the exigent circumstances that word of the protest does not reach the one possessing the field, well then, what is different about Judea and the Galilee that the Tana cited? Ostensibly, even within one of the three lands, if travel and communications are restricted, the same law would apply. If what we're saying is the problem is travel and flow of information are restricted, then why are these arbitrary distinctions, Judea, the Galilee, Transjordan? Maybe even if both the possessor and the prior owner are in Judea, but they're, divided by some kind of a line of war, like the front line, and news and people aren't getting across that, and it's some kind of, what do you call it, a siege, like a city is besieged, and information doesn't move, for several years. Well, shouldn't we be taking that into account more than some arbitrary geographic division of these regions of Israel? That's what the Gemara is asking. And the Gemara answers the Tan of our Mishnah by citing specifically a case where each is located in a different region of the land of Israel, is teaching us this, that an ordinary situation with regard to travel between Judea and the Galilee is tantamount to a period of crisis. Right? Very different world than the world we live in, where all our news from around the globe is practically instantaneous. Back then, news getting from Judea to the Galilee or vice versa, and this is under Roman occupation, could prove as difficult as, even in normal times, could prove as difficult as the flow of information or people during an actual war. Now we're on 38b. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, one cannot establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, as he is unable to lodge a protest, right? So this is a different kind of exigent circumstance. The one who left the land behind had to flee. Now we're going to talk about why did he flee. Did he flee because he had financial difficulties, or did he flee because he was running for his life? In either case, he left in a hurry, and the concern is that if now somebody occupies his land, perhaps the guy won't be able to lodge that protest within the next 3 years, because whatever circumstance led him to flee, right, in a hurry from his land, might also prevent him from hearing that somebody had occupied his land and from sending word of his protest against that back to his hometown, as it were. So let's keep reading. Right, so one cannot establish, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, again, Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, that one cannot establish the presumption of ownership with regard to property of one who is fleeing, as he is unable to lodge a protest. Rav Yehuda reports, when I said this ruling before Shmuel, he disagreed. And he said to me, but does the owner actually have to protest in the presence of the possessor? Since this is not the case, and he can lodge a protest wherever he ends up after he flees, one can establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, as long as the nature of his flight does not preclude him from sending word back. He will be able to get word back and protest against the one occupying his land. That's what Shmuel said. Hold on. So the Gemara asks, and Rav, who ruled that one cannot establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, right? So this is Rav versus Shmuel. Rav says, if the guy fled, then you can't, even in 3 years, establish presumption of ownership over his land. Shmuel says, well, if the one who fled hears that somebody took his land and sends word back, he's able to protest, so why can't we establish that hazaka, even though he fled? So now we're back to Rav. So Rav, who ruled that one cannot establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, what is he teaching us? What is Rav teaching us? That a protest that is lodged not in his presence is not a valid protest? Is Rav's reason for saying that you cannot establish a hazaka of ownership on the land of one who fled, is it because Rav holds that a protest that is not lodged in the presence of the one possessing the land is not a valid protest? That's what the Gemara is asking right now. But doesn't Rav himself say a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the one in possession of the land is nevertheless a valid protest? So the Gemara answers, Rav was explaining the reason of the Tana of our Mishnah, but he himself does not hold accordingly. Rav holds, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that the protest, not in the presence of the possessor, is nevertheless a valid protest. And there are those who say a different version of the previous discussion. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says one can establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing. And Rav Yehuda reports, when I said this ruling before Shmuel, he said to me, isn't that obvious? But does the owner actually have to protest in the presence of the possessor? And the Gemara asks, and Rav, who ruled that one can establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, what is he teaching us? Is he teaching us that a protest that is lodged not in his presence is a valid protest? But Rav already said this halakha before, and he would not need to repeat it. So rather, what Rav is teaching us now is that even if the owner protested in the presence of two witnesses who are personally unable to tell the possessor about the protest, it is nevertheless a valid protest. Why? Because since the protest was made in the presence of witnesses, even though those witnesses personally can't come back and tell the possessor of the land about the protest, they can get the word out. And eventually the word will come back, and the guy in possession of the land will know that the prior owner is challenging his ownership, and he can prepare for that litigation, which is coming, or he can leave if he was in fact trying to rob the land. Now, let me just mention where the law ends up, because I think that'll clarify the upcoming discussion. So the law is like this, the halacha, where it ended up. If the owner protested in the presence of witnesses, it is a valid protest, even if it is not in the presence of the one in possession of the land, as long as it is possible for the one in possession of the land to hear about the protest. Okay, to hear about the protest. And with regard to a period of crisis, the possession and use of property during a time of war or a time when travel is disrupted does not establish the presumption of ownership, because the prior owner might not hear about it, and even if he hears about it, he might not be able to get word of his protest back to this place. Now, the Gemara explains, as Rav Anan said, now this is with regard to the question that I just asked a moment ago, that even if the witnesses to the protest cannot personally come and tell the one in possession of the land that the prior owner is protesting against him, as long as it was made in the presence of witnesses, we expect that word will filter back to the owner. So the Gemara explains, as Rav Anan said, this was explained to me personally by Shmuel himself. If the owner protested in the presence of two people who are able to personally tell the possessor, it is a valid protest. But if the owner protested in the presence of two people who are unable to personally tell the possessor, it is not a valid protest. So Shmuel seems to disagree with what I said a moment ago. And why does Rav hold that it is a valid protest? Says Rav, because your friend who heard the protest has a friend to whom he tells about the protest, and your friend's friend has a friend to whom he tells about the protest, and so forth. Therefore, word of the protest will reach the possessor. And think about it. It's not a small matter that is being said in the presence of witnesses. The prior owner says, hey, I used to live at such and such a place, and I own such and such a house or such and such a field, or such and such an olive press, or such and such a vineyard, or such and such an orchard. And I left town, and I heard that this guy, maybe even he knows the name so-and-so, moved in to my house, my orchard, my vineyard, my olive press, whatever it is, and is using it now and claiming that it belongs to him. That man is a liar, is a robber. He has no right to be on my land. that will make news. That is the sort of thing that will get back to the town, and everybody will hear that so-and-so on Sal's piece of land, that, you know, where Sal used to live, that guy's a robber, according to Sal. And that'll get back to the alleged robber on the land. Now, Rava says the law is that one cannot establish the presumption of ownership with regard to the property of one who is fleeing, and a protest that is lodged not in a possessor's presence is a valid protest. And the Gemara asks, how can he say these two statements that contradict each other? And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, la kasha. Here in the second statement, he's referring to a case where the one fleeing fled due to monetary difficulties. In such a case, he is able to ensure that the protest reaches the possessor. While there, in the first statement, he is referring to a case where the one fleeing is fleeing from a charge of murder. Let's say it's a false charge of murder, but he fled for his life, lest, you know, the avenger of blood or whoever is after him and won't listen to the fact that he's innocent and will just kill him. He fled for his life, right? He fled for his life. And because he fled for his life and there's somebody after him trying to kill him, so he can't get the word back, because then he risks revealing where he ran to. He's not going to do that. And so in that kind of a situation where he fled for his life, let's assume innocently for a second, therefore, we cannot say that the one now occupying his land for the next 3 years assumes that presumption, or, you know, gathers for himself, achieves that presumption of ownership, because the guy who fled for his life is precluded from lodging the objection in the presence of witnesses, lest he reveal his presence and end up dead. New subject. The Gemara presents a series of disputes with regard to what is considered a valid protest. So far, all we've said is that the protest need not be made in the presence of the one possessing the land. The prior owner doesn't have to make that protest in the presence of the one now in possession of the land, but he does have to make that protest in the presence of witnesses. And those witnesses don't personally have to go notify the possessor, but it has to be done in such a way that word will get back to the one who is possessing the land. Now let's get a little more detail on what constitutes a valid protest. What manner of statement constitutes a protest? Rav Zevid said, if the owner says in general terms, so-and-so is a robber, that is not a valid protest. But if he says, so-and-so is a robber, as he is holding my land through robbery, and tomorrow, meaning in the future, I will bring a claim against him in court, that is a valid protest, right? So it's not enough to just say so-and-so is a robber. Yeah, so why are you saying that? But so-and-so is a robber who robbed my land, and I object to that, and I will lodge a protest against him in court. The litigation will begin in the future. That's a valid protest. Now we're on page 39a. If the one lodging a protest also said, do not tell the possessor of the protest, then what is the law? Well, that's odd, right? Isn't the whole point that the word has to get back to the possessor? The protest doesn't have to be made in his presence, but aren't we saying that the reason that it's valid even though it wasn't made in his presence is because word will get back to him? So if the one lodging the protest in front of witnesses says, don't tell the guy who's on my land that I protest against his possession of my land, doesn't that negate the protest? Let's see. Rav Zevid said, it is not a valid protest if you tell the witnesses not to tell the possessor, because isn't he saying, don't tell him? Therefore, word of the protest will not reach the possessor, and that protest is meaningless. But Rav Papa disagreed, and he said that the owner merely meant, don't tell him personally, but they, i.e. the witnesses, should tell others. In other words, he's saying you don't have to tell him personally, but just make sure that word gets back to him. That's what he meant when he says, don't tell him. In that case, word of the protest will reach the possessor, since your friend has a friend whom he tells about the protest, and your friend's friend has a friend, and eventually the word will get back to the possessor. Now, if the witnesses before whom the owner lodged the protest said to him, we are not going to tell the possessor about your protest. Then what is the law? Rav Zevid said, well, then it's not a valid protest. And he has to lodge a protest before other witnesses, as are they not saying to him, we're not going to tell the possessor about your protest? So Rav Zevid making the same point as before. And Rav Papa again disagrees and said, when they said we're not going to tell him, they merely meant we're not going to tell him personally, but we are going to tell other people. So in that case, word of the protest will reach the possessor, since your friend has a friend who tells about the protest and your friend's friend has a friend, and so the word will get back. If the one lodging the protest also said to them, to the witnesses, a word should not emerge from you about this, then what is the law? Rav Zevid said, not a valid protest, as isn't he saying to them, a word should not emerge from you? Similarly, and therefore the possessor will never hear of it, so it's a meaningless protest. And similarly, if the people before whom he protested said to him, we will not have a word emerge from us, Rav Papa said, this is not a valid protest, as aren't they saying to him, we will not have a word emerge from us? Sounds like, right now, Rav Papa agrees, if they all are sort of swearing themselves to secrecy, don't say a word about this, we won't say a word about this. Okay, well then they just ensured that word of the protest won't get back to the possessor. And that does negate the protest. Even Rav Papa would agree with that. But Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, disagreed, even with Rav Papa as well as Rav Zevid. He disagreed and said, it is a valid protest, because with regard to any matter that is not actually incumbent on a person to keep secret, it is likely that he will say it to others unawares, and therefore the presumption is that word will reach the possessor. I'm not sure where the law ends up on that. Let's see. A word should not emerge from you. If the owner protested in the presence of two witnesses, but he also instructed them not to breathe a word of it, protest not valid, right? So Rav Zevid and Rav Papa agree they're not a valid protest. And this is the law even if the witnesses then went and told the possessor about the protest, assuming they also mentioned the owner's admonition. If the witnesses volunteered not to say a word without being asked, they weren't sworn to secrecy, they just said, we won't say a word, then the protest is nevertheless valid in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, right? Where they said, oh, we won't say a word. But they weren't sworn to secrecy by the one lodging the protest. So the fact that they said, we won't say a word, we don't take it seriously. And that is a good little piece of general advice that we're learning here from Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, that secrets are not secrets. Even if everybody swears they'll never tell anybody, okay, then maybe we have a chance to keep the secret. But in the absence of absolute, clarified, black and white, with penalty and consequences if they do breathe a word of it. In the absence of all that, the secret will get out. Even if you do all of that, the only way really for a secret never to reach the ears of anybody is to never utter the words in the first place. Right? Two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. I think there's another saying like that, but you get my meaning. But certainly, in the absence of what he calls any matter that is not actually incumbent on a person, right? Now, that's a legal definition. Here's the law on that. If one was accused of incurring a financial obligation in a certain place, and he responded that he had never been there, that's actually a different law where they're talking about when someone testifies, if his testimony contradicts someone else, it doesn't mean that one of them is lying. It just may mean that one of them had no reason to take such careful note, and now he's making a mistake. We don't assume that there's, purposeful falsehood. So that's different than what's going on here, right? But in other words, if there's no reason to know for sure that this guy will keep the secret, assume he won't keep the secret. Okay. New subject. Rava says that Rav Nachman says, a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is a valid protest. We've seen that already, and we know that's the law. Rava raised an objection to what Rav Nachman said from the Mishna, that Rabbi Yehuda says, the sages said, that establishing the hazaka of ownership requires 3 years. Why? Only in order that if the owner will be as far away as Spain and another possesses his field for a year, people will go and inform the owner by the end of the next year, and the owner will come back in the following year and take the possessor to court. And if it enters your mind that a protest that is lodged not in his presence is a valid protest, why do I need the owner to come? Let him remain there in his place and send the protest. And the Gemara answers, there Rabbi Yehuda wishes to teach us good advice, that he should come and collect the land and its produce, right? Something like important, like you're in danger of somebody else stealing your land. Yeah, don't just send a letter. Go handle that matter personally, and to the extent that you're being there, being physically there, and actually even grabbing some of the produce, which will be a visual, physical manifestation of your protest, and you'll do that in front of witnesses, etc., will make it clear to everybody that you've protested, right? Whereas doing it in front of witnesses in Spain and sending a letter, yeah, what if the letter gets lost, right? Do this personally. The Gemara asks, from the fact that Rava raised an objection to Rav Nachman, it may be inferred that he does not hold that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is a valid protest. Did he say that? But doesn't Rava say a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is in fact a valid protest? And the Gemara answers, he held that conclusion only after he heard this law from Rav Nachman, right? One of the many cases where the sages disagreed, but eventually one of the sages made the point strongly and with, in such a way that all the other sages said, you're right. And then they changed their views. Because really, what is one of the greatest indicators of an admirable mind and the mind of a leader? Someone who can say, I was wrong. This is why I was wrong. This is why I changed my mind. And I came around to the point of view of someone who showed me why I was wrong. That's a wonderful indicator of a good leader. Next subject. The Gemara relates Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Hanina, encountered the students of Rabbi Yochanan and said to them, did Rabbi Yochanan say in the presence of how many people a protest must be lodged? So far we've been assuming 2 witnesses. Rabbi Chia bar Abbas says that Rabbi Yochanan says a protest must be lodged in the presence of 2 people. But Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said a protest must be lodged in the presence of 3 people. Very interesting ruling. We know that a matter is legally established by the testimony of 2 witnesses or more, but 2 is the minimum. Why do we need to lodge this protest in the presence of 3 people? We're not saying it has to be lodged in the presence of a rabbinical court, which is very often 3 judges, 3 rabbis, but no one's talking about rabbis here. These witnesses can just be 2 laymen, 2 regular people. Why would Rabbi Abahu say, in fact, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who's already been recorded as saying it has to be lodged in the presence of 2 witnesses, why would he now say, no, actually it has to be lodged in the presence of 3 people? What's different? Now we're on page 39b, or about to be on 39b, and the Gemara suggests, shall we say that they disagree with regard to the halacha, the law of Rabba bar Rav Huna? As Rabba bar Rav Huna says, any matter that is said in the presence of 3 people is not subject to the prohibition of malicious speech, lashon hara, as it is already public knowledge. Now, this is very interesting, right? Now, here, by the way, in Aramaic, it's saying lashana b'yisha, but I'm pretty sure that this is the same as lashon hara, right? Wicked speech, malicious speech. But what are they saying? Now, just because a matter is publicly known doesn't mean that you can gossip about it to somebody that doesn't know about it, right? But a matter that is publicly known and which needs to be disseminated to protect people from coming to be harmed, repeating that kind of a matter is definitely not lashon hara. That is not gossip. That is not wicked speech. But let's drill down a little bit more closely, right? So here what they're saying is, let's just stay with what's on the page right now. If you say something in front of 3 people, that is tantamount to public knowledge. If you say it in front of 2 people, it might stay between the 3 of you. But if you say it in the presence of 3, no way. Gonna get out. Good piece of information right there. Now, the Gemara elaborates on the suggestion that the dispute, in our case, hinges on this point, that anything said in the presence of 3 is considered public knowledge, and if you repeat that, it's not lashon hara, as long as there is a legitimate legal reason to repeat it. Okay, so the one who says that a protest can be lodged in the presence of 2 people is not of the opinion that the ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna. And he holds that even if only 2 people hear of a matter, it will become public knowledge, right? Because remember, what this is turning on is the idea that even if those 2 witnesses don't themselves come and notify the one in possession of the land that the former owner is lodging a protest, it doesn't matter because the word will get back. How will the word get back? Because it will be repeated, because it will become public knowledge. But if we're saying that something doesn't, legally speaking, become public knowledge unless it's spoken in front of 3 people, that would seem to say that's why we need it to be said in front of 3 people. But the one who doesn't hold that, who says that in saying it in front of 2 people, it'll still become public knowledge, which is probably a good ruling. And the one who says that a protest must be lodged in the presence of 3 people is of the opinion that the ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna. Sounds like Rabba bar Rav Huna has a higher opinion of people's ability to keep information to themselves and not just blurt it out and start repeating it because it's gossipy, right? He says, unless it's said in front of 3 people, it has a chance of staying secret. But if it's said in front of 3 people, it will definitely get out and become public information. Is that what our case turns on? Now I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara actually rejects this suggestion. No. And we are on 39b. Now, no. Everyone is of the opinion that the ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna, that it doesn't become public information unless spoken in front of 3 people. And here, what they disagree about is with regard to this. The one who says that a protest can be lodged in the presence of 2 people holds that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is not a valid protest. Therefore, 2 witnesses suffice, as they are needed to attest only to the fact that the owner protested. And the one who says that a protest must be lodged in the presence of 3 people holds that a protest that is not lodged in his presence is a valid protest. And since the protest can be lodged not in the possessor's presence, 3 people are needed to ensure that the word of the protest will reach him. In other words, they're saying you need 2 people because you're also charging those 2 people to come and notify the possessor so that it will definitely be spoken in his presence. Whereas the one who says it doesn't have to be spoken in his presence says that it has to be done in front of 3 people so that word will eventually get back, but we don't worry about ensuring that he is served with the summons to court, right? He'll hear about it on his own because it was revealed in front of 3 people. And if you wish, say instead that everyone holds that a protest that is lodged not in the presence of the possessor is a valid protest. And here what they disagree about is this. The one who says that a protest can be lodged in the presence of only two people holds that we require testimony, and two are sufficient for testimony. And the one who says that a protest must be lodged in the presence of three people holds that we require that the matter of the protest be revealed. And for that purpose, three people are needed. In other words, revealed to the town, not just, and that way it'll get back to the guy. Whereas in front of two people, they're just saying, okay, and later we can hear testimony that the protest was lodged from those two witnesses. But the fact of the protest may never get back to the possessor until the court starts the investigation. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Looks like two questions. The first from Jonathan. Hearing things from far away. I was wondering, does this only work for Jewish geography? I am not sure it is a true thing for all. Maybe for people who had a habit of sharing information from one community to the next in order to keep the law and learning aligned. Very interesting point, right? Jonathan is saying that the Jewish community, even 2,000 years ago, was already in diaspora, was already spread over many countries, and had an excellent system of communication among the Jews in all those different lands, as compared to sort of the rest of the world, for a number of reasons. One is, right, that the Jewish people tended to be a people of the book, and therefore a much higher percentage of the Jewish people were literate, right? We're actually able to read and write in a time when not such a big percentage of the world population was able to read and write. And they were circulating all kinds of communication letters. We know that rabbis were in touch with each other in order to make sure that any advances in law, right, in halacha, were known by all the Jews and all the rabbis around the Jewish world. So that was another reason that there was communication. Also, over Jewish history, we've seen in so many times and places, Jews were precluded from owning land. So they got into some kind of business, mercantile exchange, import, export, etc. And again, that required communication among Jewish merchants in different lands. And for these and many other reasons, there was this network of communication among the Jewish people. And I would say that's still true, right? The Jewish people, who are spread over such a large portion of the world, tend to be, pretty well connected with each other, at least in the sense that we follow many of the same influencers, we read many of the same Jewish news sources. And there are other peoples who are, kind of in their own diasporas who, I don't know, maybe they're in as close touch with each other as the Jews are, but I can say the Jews are in pretty good close touch with each other. So that's why they could assume that news would filter back, to the home community about the prior owner's protest. But could we count on that in other communities? I don't know. But what we've also seen is that when there's a dispute between a Jew and a non-Jew in terms of land ownership, right, this hazaka would only be established for a Jew occupying the land that formerly belonged to another Jew. And we saw a couple days ago that if a non-Jew was occupying that land, he doesn't get a hazaka of ownership. He will have to show the deed in order to prove that he's rightfully there. And maybe that's why. Sharon, did the rabbis who communicated between communities that we have read about in other contexts also communicate protests of individuals? Were there too many of these individual cases for them to do that, as well as transmitting rabbinic rulings? Great question. I don't know. I don't know how extensive that network was. Obviously wasn't people on their phone, posting on social media or sending emails. Unbelievable the world we live in now. For a letter to go from Spain to Nehardea, months, right? Easily could take months for such a letter to make its journey. And faced with that kind of difficulty, like how much information was really flowing around. On the other hand, when we're talking about somebody in the community calling another member of the Jewish community a robber who is illegally occupying, the guy's field or a house while he's away, that's pretty big news. And so it seems like within 3 years, you could expect that that kind of news would filter out, unless there was war, famine, or some other kind of exigent circumstances. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.